Hi, this is Possibilities. My name is Cecil Walker,
And I am Adam Frower.
and today we're going to be talking about how to find some meaningful and really useful possibilities given to you from your past, which might be different than how people might typically use their past or look at their past, and definitely different how some other therapeutic approaches might make use of the past.
Mm-hmm.
I think you do a great job of describing the main differences between how are a lot of other therapeutic approaches using the past, or even how do people typically use their past and maybe become victims of their past versus how we think about using the past.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the questions that we typically get asked as solution-focused clinicians, which is relevant to this position here, is why don't you use the past, right? If somebody's had a trauma, or if somebody's had a troubling childhood or something like that, don't you need to go back into the past and to figure out what the root cause of the issue is? Or don't you have to go back into the past so that you can understand what it means, or what impact it's having on the person right now?
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we take that idea, if we take that conceptualization, in some sense, what we're saying is, given what happened in the past, it's like set a trajectory, or in some sense, it's dictating what the current situation is. That there's no way to disentangle what happened to what is happening. And I think that if we get caught in that causal thinking,
Right.
that it really narrows into one possibility, which I think is why we've chosen to talk about it here today, is that if you take that perspective or that conceptualization, it limits possibilities. It says this one thing happened, and therefore you're injured or you're wounded or whatever, and you're going to carry that with you, and it's going to impact everything else that happens from now forward, right? And so oftentimes when we look at the past, we, in some sense, I think I'm going to use, I guess, strong language, we become prisoners of the past, right? Where we're locked, our current situation is locked or bound in some way because of the past. And I think what we're hoping to talk about today is maybe a different way that we can think about or talk about that, which I guess I'll launch into, but maybe give you a chance to say, did I get it okay?
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. I think you depicted how, I like how you described how it gives you a singular path forward. It gives you one single possibility. Like if someone has experienced a significant trauma, you have to walk through that. I'm a traumatized person. I am someone carrying trauma, and here's how my life has to go. Here's the path that I have to walk along. And I think that's what leads a lot of people to ask questions like, how do I fix trauma? How do I work on trauma? A lot of clinicians ask, how do you work with trauma? How do you treat someone who has trauma? And I think that same kind of thing can be applied to lots of other difficulties that people might have experienced in the past.
Yeah, and I think that for the people coming in, oftentimes they say, but I'm traumatized, or I've experienced a trauma. And again, the clinicians get caught into that like tunnel, one possibility of being. But I think clients as well say, because this happened to me, now my life is a tainted life, or a bruised life in some way. And they also begin to limit what's possible for them.
Right, exactly. But I think all of that is very much juxtaposed by and very different from how we see the possibilities that you can get from your past. And I think part of the reason people don't use all these multiple possibilities you can get from your past is because I think they think there's only that one way that you can look at the past.
Yeah, which I guess then leads us into, so then how do we view looking at the past in a different way? And I think one of the things that I would say about this idea is we've kind of started gravitating to this word of legacy. and I think we use that in a lot of ways, but I think in some sense, we can look at our past as a legacy that we get to go back and draw on,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think if I were to give an example, oftentimes we think about like being handed an inheritance,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or from our ancestors who have come before us, there are certain physical traits that we have inherited, or there are personality characteristics that we think that, people tell us, oh, that's just like your grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
or you got that from your aunt,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, right? And we hear about these things that we get from people that obviously have come before us that maybe we knew, maybe we didn't know. But I think in some sense, besides just the people, there are life experiences, there are life events that we can kind of gain a legacy from, I think the way that I would summarize it is we could have learned valuable lessons from this particular experience or event, or we could have created really important memories, really meaningful bits. And sometimes those meaningful bits are intermingled with hardship and trauma and difficulty, right? It's a significant person who reached out to us in a meaningful way, or it's a kind word that was spoken to us in that moment. And so we don't want to say like you completely ignore the hardship or the challenge or the difficulty, but we're looking at the past, and it's almost like we're extracting from those things. We're like looking really microscopically at, but in the mix of all of that, what lessons did you learn?
Mm-hmm.
What important memories do you have? What feelings, meaningful feelings, do you carry with you as a result of important people or significant moments?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in some sense, it's almost like an investigation of the past. And we're infusing meaning into those experiences from the present and what we know now, and what resulted from those moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's everything that you're describing is fits so perfectly, because all of that speaks to seeing the past as a place full of resources, a place full of really useful information, things that can contribute to a whole plethora of possibilities for your future. And I think to overlook all of that is such a big mistake. And I think if we look at the lives of people who accomplish really incredible things, it's very likely that they must have been drawing on these resources from their past. They must have been looking at the resources from their past. I once read that there's like this selection bias of people who have immigrated to the U.S. And if you look at U.S. history over the years, it's full of innovators. It's full of people who are the first or the best at all these different things, all these major companies and inventions, all these things that are founded here in the U.S. And it's partially because the people who migrated to the U.S. were people who either were dealing with really, really difficult things and had to overcome those things to get here, or they were people who had the ambitions and felt like they had the spark of whatever intellectual things that it took to go out into this frontier and try something new. And their children saw that that's what they were coming from. And so more often than not, they would go on to do these really incredible things, or try these new things, or quite literally travel across the frontier, establish new states, and all those kinds of things. And that's how we ended up with a large portion of the Nobel laureates who are Americans are the children of immigrants or immigrants themselves, because they could see from their recent past what was possible for them. They could see, here are the things that are kind of invested in me that I think I could draw on to go and do all these incredible things.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. And it made me think actually of another kind of phrase that I've been looking at and studying recently. And one of the things that the research that I'm looking at has kind of contrasted what they're calling a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. And I think one of the things that you're describing is people who have a fixed mindset. they go into a task, right? And they think, I'm either good at this, or I'm bad at this, or I'm going to be good at this, or I'm going to be bad at this. And they go in, and in some sense, when you try something for the first time, no matter who you are, most likely you're going to fail. Right? And so people who go in with a fixed mindset and they think, I'm bad at this, they'll give up and they'll say, like, it's not worth it, I'm bad at this, right? Whereas people who go in with what they call this growth mindset, they go in and they think, I've never done this before. I have the possibility of getting good at this. And so when they fail, inevitably, because we all do, they look at that as an opportunity to do what we're kind of talking about, of like pulling it apart and saying, where did I fail? Why did I fail? What could I do to compensate so I don't fail in that way again? And then they try again, and they are very purposeful to say, okay, I'm not going to do that thing again. But inevitably, they'll fail again. But they use each iteration of failure to say, how do I compensate, right? And I think in some sense, each of those iterations become our past, right? I have a past full of failures. I can either look at those as evidence that I'm no good or that I'm failed, or I can look at those as I got one step closer to succeeding. And I think what's really fascinating about all of this too is that also in the things that I've been looking at and researching and studying, I found that in some sense, we kind of think about memory as a static thing, right? That we have accurate retrieval of what happened. And when you look actually at the neuroscience, we don't have these like storage files full of accurate memories. What we have is like snapshots that we kind of piece together. But what's really fascinating is that it's really influenced by what is we call our working memory, right? It's not that we have great long-term memory. It's that we have working memory that influences our long-term memory. So whatever our circumstances are, whatever we're going through right now in the moment, it changes the way that we recall what actually happened. So, and many of us probably can relate to that, because if I tell the same story that happened, 10 years ago to different people, I'm going to tell the story slightly differently, or I'm going to include certain details and leave out other details depending on who I'm talking to, because you know some things about me, and so I'm going to include details that are relevant to what you know about me. Whereas if I talk to somebody else, different details are going to come up because they know different things about me, or we have a different kind of relationship. And so the past, in some sense, is always constantly being created in this particular moment. And I think if we buy into I'm going to go back and look at that experience, I'm going to track what impact it had, we're giving all of the credit to inaccurate long-term memory instead of saying we have a huge possibility to influence that memory by what's currently happening. If I'm in a positive interaction, I could positively impact how you think about what happened to you.
That, I think, is such a fantastic way to look at the past, because it takes you from saying, here's what happened to me and here's what my future will be because of my past, to here's what I can do with my past. Here's what I can take from it, and the actions that I can take, the steps I can take, the ways I can think of it that can give me whatever it is that I think I want for my future. But I'm sure at this point, this is where people begin to ask, well, then how do I do that? How do I make the switch to begin to use my past rather than being used by my past, maybe, or being a product of my past? How do you answer that question?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And I think this is going to sound a bit like a broken record, but I think in some sense you fail forward, right? You do exactly what we just outlined of, you go into it thinking, I've been living a life that's been limited to one possibility. And so I'm gonna go forward, and I'm gonna try to view it differently. I'm gonna tell myself a different narrative, or I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna say, so what positive aspects are there that I could get, right? So I
Mhm.
think in some sense it's a reevaluation of the past to say, like, am I overlooking something that could be there? But I think then it's a telling your story in a slightly different light and maybe failing a bit and still maybe saying it was horrible and it's dictated what's happened to me. But then looking at it and saying, why did I get tripped up on that detail again? If I were to tell it again, how would I want to make sure I tell it this time? So I think that's a part of it, is going back, investigating and saying, what am I overlooking? I think step 2 is talking about it in a different way and knowing that inevitably you'll fail, but learn from that failure. And then I think the third thing actually might seem counterintuitive, but it's then looking to the future, right? And it's saying, how do I want the past to influence my future? We also know that working memory impacts how we envision the future, right? What do I think is possible? And so if I go back and I say, I forgot that this person really touched my life in that very difficult moment, then I can look forward and I can say, I want to be the person who can touch somebody else's life in that way. And I've changed the possibility of I'm forever a wounded person to maybe I'm a person who could heal somebody else because I experienced that one touch of compassion in a moment of hardship. And so I think a third thing is to look forward and say, how do you want the past to impact the future?
Yeah, that reminds me so much of my own personal journey from my childhood and then through education, which I think has been an important step in me getting to who I am and where I am now, and that journey into adulthood. And whenever I talk to people about the things that I experienced in my childhood and how I got to where I am now, I think they see it as a story of a lot of difficulty. And I think objectively, there were some obstacles, definitely. Having lost my mother when I was only 17, I think, and having to start undergraduate without any of her guidance or help after she was my only caregiver for my entire life. Along with other circumstances, we were poor and no one in my family had gone to college or anything like that. Yet when I look at my life, when I look back over these things, I feel very much like I've been lucky. I feel like a lot of things that I experienced, these are stories of me being able to grow over things rather than these things happened at me and crushed me or set me back or something like that. And that sounds like kind of what you were describing. But I think what's also invested in this, especially when you use language like legacy, is I did have to go from feeling like I don't know what I'm doing as I'm going down this path. I don't know that I belong, at a university studying higher education. I don't know that the things that I think I might want for my future are even available to me. And it was only through, like you said, through a bit of trial and error, a bit of realizing that maybe my perspective was actually the real obstacle there. It was the real thing that was dictating the path that I was going down, rather than actually what I was capable of. And as I started to realize that and make changes to that and think that I'm very capable of a lot of things, actually, it seems that I'm just as capable of the things that everyone else at this university and in graduate school are capable of. And that's when I could begin to feel like I whatever I wanted, I could have. The future that I wanted for myself, I could have. And I feel like part of that change was necessary because no one before me in my family had ever gone to school. That was the legacy I was seeing. That was what I was making of the past. Was I don't think these things are for me because they haven't been for anyone else who came before me.
Yeah.
And I could see how the opposite could be true. If I were to have children, those children could think, it's kind of a given. Of course, maybe we'll go to school and all these things that we might want will be possible for us, because that would be their legacy. That's what they will be they'll be getting from their past.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you were talking, some memories of my own life, not connected to education, but when I was 8 years old, my mom was young. She was 37, and she had a massive heart attack. And she had to have open heart surgery, and she was in the hospital, and I didn't know if she was coming home or not.
Yeah.
And I remember two significant things during that time that then came back later, and I think had a profound impact on me. One thing that I remember is while she was in the hospital, my older sister, so I'm one of 5 children, right? So my oldest sister all of a sudden became the de facto laundry person. She all of a sudden had to do laundry for all of us because we were young. And I remember one day going down and I needed new clean underwear. And I opened the dryer, and everything in the washing machine or dryer now that used to be white was now pink. She had washed one red item in with all of the white things. And as an 8-year-old boy, I was devastated. I was like, there is no way I'm putting on pink underwear and going to school. Like, that is not happening. And I was beside myself. And I remember talking to my poor dad, like now as a dad, thinking like the last thing he needs to worry about while his wife is in the hospital having a heart attack is pink underwear, right? But I remember like just crying and being like, I can't wear these. And him trying to rationalize with me and be like, no one's going to see them. Like, they're covered.
Right.
It doesn't matter. And I was like, I can't. Like, I can, if by chance anyone sees my pink underwear, life is over. Right. And I remember he was just, like, he was so patient, and he tried to explain. And my sister is now like devastated, right? She's crying because now she's ruined everybody's laundry. And I just remember my dad saying, we'll work it out. And I don't know how he did it, but somehow he went to the store, he got new underwear, and I could wear white underwear to school. And that like solved my problems, right? So I'll come back then to how that came back later. But the other experience that I remember is shortly after my mom came home. And she had, back then it was in the 80s, so like open heart surgery was like, it was all the way open, and she had a massive scar. I remember thinking like, that is the size of my my pinky is like all the way down her chest. And a few months after, we were going to go swimming, and she put on her swimsuit. And so I could see a large portion of her scar. And I remember saying to my mom, are you going to go to the pool like that? And again, as an 8 or 9-year-old kid, I think she heard it as I was embarrassed to go to the pool with her because she looked like that. And I remember having a conversation with her then later as I was an adult, and that was a memory that really stood out to her, that she was embarrassing me. And I remember saying to her, I wasn't embarrassed to be with you. I was nervous that you were going to be embarrassed because people would stare at you. So my concern was for her. I didn't even think what it might do to me, right? But then fast forward many years, and in 2019, my wife was then diagnosed with breast cancer, right? And those two my youngest child at that time was 8 years old. So I find myself now as the partner of the parent, and the parent of the 8-year-old who was the same age that I was. And I think in that moment, right, that could, oftentimes other psychotherapy approaches would say that's a triggering event, or the trauma comes back to you, or how did that impact you? But those two events came back to me in that instance. And I remember thinking, I have to do everything I can to not get worked up over the little things like pink underwear, right? I remember my dad being very patient with me. And I remember him saying, like, we'll work it out. And somehow, to this day, I don't know how he worked it out, but somehow he worked it out. And I remember thinking, as the parent of children who are going through something very difficult, I need to be like my dad. The legacy that I inherited was one of patience, one of problem solving, and I needed to be that in this moment. The other experience, strangely, was when my wife was going to take my children swimming, and she had no hair.
Right.
And my youngest daughter, who was 8 years old, said to her exactly what I had said to my mom. Are you going to go swimming like that? And my wife, leaving the room and crying because she thought that she was embarrassing her children. And it was in that moment that I had the opportunity to say, I'm not sure that she's the one that's embarrassed. I think maybe she's nervous that you would be embarrassed. And then my wife was able to come out and they were able to have a conversation. And sure enough, my daughter was saying, I wouldn't want people to look at me. I'm nervous that people will look at you. And my wife had an opportunity to say, it's okay if people look at me. And she was able to give my daughter an opportunity to be confident and to say, it's okay if people look at us. And so again, I think we don't know in those moments that look like tragedy that those things aren't going to come back as the greatest life lessons for something that we're going to have to do again. And I think if we limit ourselves to the impact of one possibility, we lose huge experiences for happiness, for learning, for opportunities to connect.
Yeah. And had you not seen it that way, I could see how you would have continued a line of what essentially felt like injury. You know, if in that moment, like you said, if you saw that as a triggering rather than a reminder of what you and your parents were capable of, and then what you needed to do in that moment, your children would have carried on more of the same. They would have carried that same trigger on, and their children maybe even too. So that switch obviously is something really, really significant and influential in how we experience things, and the meaning making too that we carry, like you said, in the moment, the meaning we're making in the moment of our past and consequentially of the future too.
And I think keeping with that word, right? We do inherit a legacy. We are handed a legacy, but we also have the possibility of handing a legacy on. And I think if all we do is think about our past as problematic, we're very likely to pass on, like you mentioned, a problematic legacy. But if we look at the past as something that's possibilities of growth, possibilities of learning, we get to pass on a legacy of growth and learning.
I think that is something potentially powerful for someone who maybe never even realized that they could do something different with their past. And so hopefully this is helpful to anyone who this might be something really, really new and kind of exciting for.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, so I guess that's what I would say is think about your past as something full of possibilities.
Well, I think that's all for today. This was Possibilities. Thanks for tuning in. Anything else?
I don't think so. No, I think that's good.
Okay. Well, I think they should like and subscribe. They should.
They should. All of those things.
Keep up with this channel and look out for more possibilities in the future.